What? Hello, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. I'm Brenda Brook, and I'm the co-chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Thursday evening to So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex by Ian Kerner. We're celebrating 70 years of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair with an entire year of book and story programming. So join us as we honor the world's first Jewish book fair, highlighting diverse authors, curating new Jewish writing, and promoting the global art of Jewish storytelling. To see our full schedule, watch events you might have missed, and find our online bookstore where you can buy tonight's book and plenty of other books, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair, and you can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so I want to thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. I want to personally extend my deepest gratitude to the entire Book Fair committee. Their dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work have made all of this possible. We have an enlightening program for you this evening, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting to the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many of your questions as they can. And while you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. And that way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. Our focus this evening is the book, So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, Laying Bare and Learning to Repair Our Love Lives, with the author Ian Kerner. And also joining us tonight is Stephanie Gorlich, a local therapist who will moderate the discussion. In So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, Dr. Kerner uses wit and warmth to share his tried and true techniques and tools for readers to realize their sexual potential. He'll help readers figure out what's working and what's not in their sex script. And with the help of decades of clinical insight, the latest sexual science and research, this insightful and original book strips away discomfort and gives readers the ability to not just talk about sex openly and knowingly, but to actually do something about it. Dr. Ian Kerner is a licensed psychotherapist and nationally recognized sexuality counselor who specializes in sex therapy, couples therapy, and working with individuals on a range of relational issues. He is the New York Times bestselling author of She Comes First and many more, focusing on healing sexuality and relationships. He's a clinical fellow of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, certified by the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, where he also sits on the board, and the Society for Sex Therapy and Research, and the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy. Dr. Stephanie Gorlich is an award-winning author, certified sex therapist, and board-certified sexology diplomate. She's the founder of Bound Together Counseling, a boutique sex therapy practice based here in Metro Detroit. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Ian Kerner and Dr. Stephanie Gorlich.
Thank you, Brenda.
Hi, Ian.
Hey, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm doing well. I love this so much. Just last fall, you and I were together on Zoom, but I got to kind of visit your hometown of New York for the Society for Sex Therapy and Research. And now tonight, you're in my hometown for a conversation about, so tell me about the last time you had sex.
Yeah, I'm excited. I wish I could be there in person, but one of these days, right?
Eventually, our paths will cross in person.
Yes.
I would love to hear about how you came to be here, not necessarily in the chair on the Zoom tonight, but what first brought you to doing this work?
Oh, are we talking about the path to becoming a sex therapist?
It's everybody's favorite question. How do we become sex therapists?
You know, and it's so interesting because these days I often supervise or mentor young psychology students who seem to know right away that they want to pursue this path of working in sex therapy or mental health. For me, it was really more of a second or a third career. And I'll be honest, as a young guy growing up and sort of becoming an adult, I really struggled with basic sexual issues and sexual questions. For example, Stephanie, today I see tons of young men who are in their 20s and 30s who are completely physically functional, but they have so much performance anxiety around sex that they have psychological erectile unpredictability. So we're going to be using some specific language here tonight, just to let you know. And so I relate, because as a young guy, I had my own issues, except I didn't grow up in a world of the internet. There weren't even books at the time. There were Masters and Johnson and Kinsey, and as I said, there was no internet. So I was really in a fog, and my love life, my sex life was kind of a disaster, and I became quite depressed, and I kind of retreated. I just really wasn't able to launch. And then finally, and it's themes really in my book that we'll talk about, hopefully, I found my way to sexual health. And but it was a painful and it was a long journey. And when I had a chance to change my career, I knew I was very passionate about doing this work, and I wanted to connect and communicate with others, both through my clinical practice and through my book. So here I am today. And as you know, Stephanie, well, I know this about you from your talk, a couple of months ago, sex therapists often tend to be evangelists or advocates in the field. And so many of us began this work because we felt what I would say is erotically marginalized in some way. So I would say that that's sort of my story. And I still love connecting with people and just creating a safe space for their sexual selves to emerge and come and talk.
I love that so much. The ability to make connections with the people that we're working with, to help them make connections with their partners or find partners, is really one of the privileges of doing sex therapy work. I am curious, you mentioned sexual health, and that term can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So when you talk about helping people move towards sexual health, what do you mean? What is your vision for your clients?
Yeah, it can be very different for everyone. And so for me, my vision of sexual health, especially as I was becoming sexual and having problems, was really being able to experience and generate pleasure without shame and without anxiety, to be present in a sexual experience, whether that sexual experience was relational and intimate and an experience of lovemaking, or just something that might have been fun and about my own lightness and growth, but really being able to be present and to be authentic in that experience, and to not feel sort of overshadowed by cultural expectations, cultural discourses around sex. So I would say that my focus in terms of sexual health is helping people to get present and get into pleasure in ways that are authentic and unique to them, and that connect with their partners. And so that also means a lot of interrelationality and communication as well.
That understanding that pleasure is a part of healthy sexual functioning, that pleasure is not a secondary thing that we might get if we're lucky, but a core part of what it means to be healthy as sexual adult beings, is a really powerful statement. I'm curious how you bring that into your work with your clients.
Well, one thing that I wanted to say is that, very often in couples therapy, when couples have sex problems, it used to be the standard line that couples therapists would say, well, let's work on your relationship and getting you two to communicate. And then the sex issues will kind of figure themselves out, as though sex is always just a subset of a relationship. And, there are studies that have shown that couples who have positive, healthy sexual relationships and have sex once a week have higher levels of overall relationship positivity than couples who don't, right? And it doesn't have to be 3, 4, 5 times a week, but couples who had sex less than once a week do not have those same levels of relationship positivity. So I just want to add that sex provides a tremendous boost of positivity to our relationships. And it's not just something that's a subset or secondary. And I work with so many couples who, when it came to making their choices of partner or life partner, sex might not have been the highest thing on the list. It might not have even been in a medium space on the list. And I think that that's a mistake, because sex is a very important part of the human life cycle and the relational life cycle.
Absolutely. Some of my favorite couples to work with in my practice are people that weren't those folks that prioritize sex in finding a partner. Many of my clients were deeply religious. They might not have kissed or in one instance even held hands until they were married. So I'm curious, when we have couples, when we have people that are not necessarily raised to understand pleasure as a part of health, conversations about pleasure can feel really uncomfortable. So how do you get couples that you work with to tell you about the last time they had sex? How do you bring up that conversation?
Well, it's really, I wrote the book because it's really a question that I ask in almost every first session, whether I'm sitting with an individual or a couple. And I don't know quite what it must be like for you in Detroit, but here in New York, people are really rushing around. They don't have time for anything, much less therapy. And by the time a couple gets to see a sex therapist, I would say almost across the board, they've waited too long. They've waited until they're in some state of crisis, like they've been in a sex rut for 3 years and they're lying next to each other, but they're a million miles apart. So I really wanted to develop an approach where I could help a couple in the first session. I could relieve some of that pain. It's kind of like when I went to the dentist and I needed a root canal. I waited so long. I didn't care what you did or how much it cost. Just get me out of pain. And so a couple will come in, or an individual will come in, and their sexual selves want to talk. They've exiled their sexual selves often. And so their sexual selves want to talk. They may not have the language. I think it helps for people to know that I've written about my own personal journey. I think it helps to know that I'm someone that honors sexuality in my work and that they can really have that conversation. And usually in the first 15 or 20 minutes, I'll really learn about what's happening, and I'll kind of treat the issue almost like it's own planet that I want to walk around. I want to look at the biological factors and the physical factors and the relational and the sociological factors, right? Because if a couple or an individual isn't experiencing desire, let's say, there could be so many factors. So I kind of want to get a big picture view of the planet. But then most importantly, I want to understand where the issue, the problem, or the conflict is coming up in the relationship. Where it's coming up during sex, right? I want to see exactly where it's occurring. So I'm just noticing all of these comments that are coming up. I'm sorry, they were they were very colorful, so they were just distracting me for a second, but I'll get used to it. And so I'll ask a couple to tell me about the last time they had sex, basically. And why do I do that? Because I feel like every sexual event tells a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a sequence of behaviors that we've engaged in. Our sex script either works or it doesn't. I think as a couple in a long-term relationship, I kind of relate to the idea of like, you kind of have a good working sex script, and it's like your favorite food, your favorite takeout. It's kind of your default. And so when our sex scripts are working and we're connecting, great, no problem. But when they're not, we can feel really isolated. And so by walking through a sexual event, how did a couple get started? Who initiated? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? When did it happen? What did they do to connect and generate arousal and create some warmth and simmer that warmth? How did they continue to build arousal? What behaviors did they engage in? What behaviors didn't they engage in? What was off the table and why? Who experienced pleasure? Who didn't? Who had orgasms? Who didn't? How did the experience leave them? Did they feel positive and rejuvenated and connected? Or did they feel alone and isolated because some part of them wasn't speaking, connecting, being authentic, right? So there's so much that happens in a single sexual event. And generally, if I know what the problem is, and I know what the event looked like, or what I call the sex script, we can very quickly get into the process of rewriting that sex script.
Can you unpack that term a little bit for me? Help me understand what you mean when you say a couple's sex script.
I mean, literally, like if I were a fly on the wall, what would I be seeing from beginning to end? Almost like my own little movie. I mean it like a movie script. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A lot can happen, but what's the journey? What is the journey and what happened across the journey? Now, it's an interesting question, Stephanie, because however we are having sex, whatever our personal sex script is, it's informed by larger cultural sex scripts, for example. So for example, so many of the couples, the heterosexual couples that I work with, their sex scripts are almost totally focused around intercourse. And that's just a single behavior, right? I'm not knocking intercourse, but it's just a single behavior, but it becomes so important and so all-encompassing that it might not generate the pleasure it needs to. It might create anxiety, but we have this idea about what sex should look like, right? And we compare ourselves to that. So very often we're not advocating for our pleasure. We're not speaking for ourselves because we're ashamed. What if it doesn't fit in with whatever I think that sex script is supposed to be? I'm going to feel shame. I'm going to feel awkward. And so I'm not going to assert my true sexual personality.
In my practice, I do a lot of similar work, have similar conversations, especially around the idea of penetration or intercourse as being the goal of sex. How do you help your clients move past that and look at other ways to define successful sex for themselves?
Yeah, so if you go back to my book, She Comes First, basically I struggled under what I call the intercourse discourse. I was supposed to show up as a guy and have sex in a specific way. And basically I couldn't get the lovemaking that I wanted to have in my mind to connect with my body, right? So I was failing. And so for me, I could have continued to fail by continuing to just try and meet this expectation of what I thought I was supposed to be as a sexual male. But then I started to really do some research and I started to learn about female sexual pleasure. And I started to learn that, hey, even if I could last as long as I wanted and have the absolute erection that I wanted to have, that might not mean that my partner would experience any pleasure, right? So I sort of really got, I sort of, in my first book, I kind of coined the term cliteracy as because I was sort of ill-cliterate at the time. I just didn't understand the role of the clitoris in generating pleasure for women. I thought that anything that I experienced one way would be experienced the same way. So I kind of rebelled against the intercourse discourse by really embracing outer course. All of the activities, my hands, my mouth, my mind, that I could use to generate pleasure and be in the moment, that really largely wasn't intercourse based. So I think I certainly don't, all of my answers are so long, but I certainly don't define sex by a single behavior. I really think of it as an experience, and whatever we choose to gain, however we choose to create our sex scripts, I want them to be very personalized paths to pleasure.
I think that you're not long, you're thorough, and it's glorious. In listening to you, you made me think of our friend and colleague Lori Mintz, who does so much work around female sexual pleasure and function. And she, in one of her writings, said that only about 61% of heterosexual women reported having an orgasm in their last sexual experience. Sorry, 64 is 91% of the men. So
Mhm.
this idea that what works for the male partner will pleasure the female partner is absolutely a really common misconception.
Yeah, I mean, Lori's writing about what we know as the orgasm gap, which also comes out of the work of Debbie Herbenik and her team at Indiana University. And yeah, there is a big orgasm gap there. There is a big pleasure gap, and it creates a lot of stress and tension because a lot of women aren't experiencing the pleasure that they want to experience, and they might be faking their pleasure or not talking about it or growing resentful. But a lot of men also feel a pressure to perform in a certain way, and that's why I think young men who are experiencing, tremendous erectile unpredictability are suffering so much as well. So I think we all suffer under the shadow of the intercourse discourse.
To that point, we have a question from Gwen. Gwen says so many men use the term performing, which makes her think of Cirque du Soleil, people as performers. And she wonders, what might you say when that term comes up? Is there perhaps a way to reframe it or to help them diminish the shame or embarrassment that they feel when they're talking about their own perceptions of their performance?
Yeah, I mean, once somebody starts to worry about their performance, it's really kind of deadly to sex because it creates a lot of anxiety, and anxiety is the enemy of arousal. I like to say that when it comes to sex, there's sort of like the super villain of sex is anxiety, and the superhero of sex is arousal. And once we start worrying about our performance, the super villain of anxiety has emerged. And so I talk to my patients about being present, as we said, and being very mindful and really in the moment, sensually. I talk about pleasure quite a bit. And I guess I would often sometimes use that classic term that Masters and Johnson introduced to us, just called spectatoring, where you're watching yourself having sex rather than being in the sex itself. I'm not sure if that answers Gwen's question. If she has a follow-up, I'm happy to continue.
I will keep my eye out for it. I love the spectatoring model. I think that giving people permission to kind of remove themselves from the anxiety, as you said, of proving that they are connected, engaged, happy, successful in their performance can be a really wonderfully liberating thing. Let me ask this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, one other quick thing I wanted to say to Gwen's question is so often when I'm looking at a couple's sex script or an individual's sex script and we need to rewrite it, very often I will ask them to take intercourse off the table for a period of time if that's the activity that they feel that they most have to perform in or be present for. So I really endeavor to help couples create a non-pressured, non-demand environment. And I often give homework assignments that really say, let's focus on something specific, some kind of arousal, whether it's physical or psychological, but let's really decouple that from any expectation of having to have sex. So I just wanted to mention sort of doing what you can to create a really non-pressured environment.
We have talked about a number of sort of barriers to successful implementation of a sex script. Let me flip it around. What are the key elements of a good sex script?
Sure. Yeah, I love that. Let's get positive. Well, first of all, I think it's about sort of getting going and, respecting that each partner might experience desire differently. And we could talk about that later, but just the idea that we want to get our desire frameworks, how we experience, sort of overlapping in a way that feels right and organic. So there is, that phase of desire. Sometimes things can be a very hot start and very hot and passionate. Sometimes it can be a warm start, just sort of sitting on the couch next to someone. Sometimes it could even be a cold start where we aren't necessarily in the mood to have sex, but we have a willingness because it's important. But then what I really pay attention to, I always ask a couple this once they tell me how, when, and how something got started. I always say, well, what happened next? And sometimes they're like, well, we had sex. No, let's get a little closer. Let's get a little more near experience. I really want to know, how did they generate arousal? How did they generate arousal above the neck, above the waist, right? I'm not interested in the genitals just yet. I really want to get couples focused on different kinds of sensual stimuli, sensual connection that can happen. But I'm also very interested in helping couples get comfortable with psychological arousal. And sometimes couples are unfamiliar with what I mean by that term. And, plenty of studies show that women can fantasize their way to orgasms in many cases. And certainly men are capable of gaining erections through thinking and seeing and fantasizing. So all of that is the power of just psychological arousal, some kind of reverie, some kind of fantasy or image or thought. But we so rarely are fluent in engaging that sort of psychological language with each other. It can be a very aggressive question. What's your fantasy, or what's your turn on? It could really shut people down. So I do have a lot of specific techniques for helping individuals and couples to incorporate psychological arousal into the sex script. And I kind of call this phase of the sex script just kind of like the arousal runway, and really developing a nice arousal runway so that a couple is in sync, they're percolating, they're simmering. And then, of course, we also want to maintain that arousal very often through genital stimulation. And so what behaviors are couples engaging in at that point? And are they staying in sync? And are they losing each other? Or is it working and they're gaining mutual pleasure, generating mutual pleasure? What's very interesting too about sex that can be confusing for some couples is we very much want to turn on and get excited about the sex we're having and have some novelty or have some unpredictability or something that's a little different. I mean, we all can probably remember peak sexual experiences, and they're probably peak because they had some really exciting or new quality to it at one time. But at a certain point in a sex script, you really want to go sort of on autopilot. You kind of want to just go unconscious a little bit, like you don't want to be thinking anymore. A lot of studies, especially of female sexuality, there was one of my favorite studies was done in the early 2000s in Amsterdam, in which a researcher wanted to see what's happening in the female brain throughout the process of arousal. And they had about 20 women, I think, and they put them in sort of these fMRI scanners while their partners were stimulating them. So they were effectively being stimulated manually while their brains were being monitored. And what was really interesting in all of the fMRI scans was that as women were getting more aroused, parts of the brain were really lighting up that were associated with touch and sexual and sensual pleasure. But the more women got aroused, and especially the closer to orgasm that they got, another part of the brain was shutting down in the amygdala. Parts of the brain that were associated with sort of anxiety, outside stressors, distractions, intrusive thoughts. So really, what this researcher said is that, wow, it's like the women are kind of going into almost like a trance-like state. There's like a mental deactivation that's kind of happening. And so in a way, sex is about turning on, but it's also about feeling so comfortable and so relaxed that you can turn off. And I think it's in that turned off state where our brains aren't working anymore. It's like driving and knowing how to drive and knowing the route you're on and not even thinking about the drive, that we can really let go and surrender to pleasure and experience orgasm together, and then also feel connected afterwards. So I guess those are some of the elements that I'm looking for in a sex script.
So we've talked about sex scripts, and I've heard you mention the term desire framework. How do those two vary? If the sex script is how a sexual experience or encounter plays out, what is the desire framework?
Well, I imagine you would concur that desire issues, whether it's mismatched libido, some kind of desire discrepancy, is usually the most common issue that couples are coming in with. And and especially during COVID, I actually thought in the beginning that people were going to be having more sex during COVID. Like, right, you don't have to commute. Like, there's not much to do. Like, let's get back to basics. But boy, was I wrong, right? Because we weren't eating well, we weren't taking care of ourselves the way we should be. We were on top of each other. We weren't thinking or feeling our sexiest. We weren't getting out and feeling actualized and alive. So really during COVID, I saw a tremendous spike in desire issues in couples not having sex, maybe not wanting to, or one partner wants to. And I think when there's a mismatched libido, it's often just very easy to start misreading and mislabeling each other. And very often what I find is there's really just a difference in desire frameworks and the way that partners experience desire. So for example, a lot of partners, male, female, might experience desire quite spontaneously, quite quickly. I call it sort of highly reactive desire because, hey, there's my cute wife coming out of the shower, getting dressed. Boy, she looks sexy. And I can really feel that very quickly in my body. And it doesn't matter if I was working or if a kid is crying or there's a fire alarm going off, I can get very focused. I have that highly reactive desire. And I think a lot of us, especially a lot of the men that I work with, can relate to kind of being in that spontaneous framework. But for a lot of people, men and women included, desire may sometimes function that way. It may have at one time in the beginning of a relationship, but really desire isn't spontaneous anymore. It's not happening that way. It's a little more what I call deliberative, or the clinical term would be called responsive. You have to have a willingness. You have to want to do it and focus on wanting to do it. You have to kind of clear out some of the stressors and inhibitors and get your mind off of the things that are distracting you. And you have to be able to tune into the things that are exciting you. And sometimes it takes like a real simmering of arousal, a real simmering of not just one sexual cue, but many, to kind of arrive at a place where you want to have, where you're feeling desire. I kind of compare it to like being at an amusement park, and like you have a fast pass. One partner has a fast pass. They see that ride and they can get right on it because they have a fast pass. And for the other partner, they don't have a fast pass. They're going to have to wait online. They're going to have to ask themselves, is it going to be worth it? Why should I do it? Do I really want to go on that ride? Is it going to be a good ride? So I think that very often it's very common to be in different desire frameworks. And someone who's in a spontaneous desire framework might be very frustrated. They might be thinking, gosh, why do I always have to initiate? Why am I always the one that has to get something started? I miss being desired. forget the sex. I just want to be desired. I want to feel wanted. What's wrong with my partner? They used to want me all the time. When I'm out in the world, I can sometimes flirt a little bit, or I see people like there's desires in the air. What happened to the wanting at home? What's wrong? Is my something wrong with my partner? Are they shut down? Are they no longer attracted to me? But then the other partner might be in like more of a responsive desire framework, and they might be thinking like, geez, doesn't this person get that like we're paying bills right now and we're got to get the kids ready and there's disasters happening with our families? How can they just suddenly be thinking about sex? And why are they always thinking about sex? And what happened to some like romance or cultivating? Why do they just expect me to turn on like that? Or why are they always turning on like that? Maybe they're, I'm going to use the term, a sex addict now, because wow, they're just always turned on. No, you're both in different desire frameworks and you're not talking about it, and you're bringing an internalized set of assumptions to what's happening, is my experience.
I have had several, more than I would like to acknowledge, several clients referred to me for assessment for sex addiction. Sometimes from partners with different desire frameworks, sometimes from other clinicians who hear or work with those fast pass folks and can't imagine how that could be within their realm of normal.
Yep.
Karen has a question that ties into this conversation. She wants to know, how do you help to keep intimacy during stages when each person in the couple is going through a lower desire level, either because of a certain situation or stage like COVID, or because they've hit a new age or developmental milestone and they're just out of sync? How do you help them maintain that intimacy?
Yeah, sex really does change over the life cycle, and our desire can be very variable, even within ourselves, day to day. It's I always say that sexual desire is sort of like the stock market. You know, at a high level, it goes up, it goes down, but when you get near experience, there's so many different variables at play. And there's a model in the sex therapy community called the dual control model, which basically says that our sexual brains have two systems that operate at once: an excitation system, all the turn-ons, and an inhibition system, all the turn-offs. And certainly in a long-term relationship, the exciters start to go down. Right in the beginning of a relationship, it's all turn on, it's all exciter. We have no responsibility to each other. We're light, we're having fun, we're getting to know each other. It's the exciters are high, the inhibitors are low. But man, anybody who's been in a long-term relationship knows that those inhibitors stack up very quickly. It's like having a foot on the brake as opposed to the gas. So I do work very closely with couples around the inhibitors and collaborating to reduce the inhibitors, and also collaborating to increase the exciters. I will say again that I think that psychological arousal is key. And tomorrow, actually, I'll toot my own horn. I did a TED Talk in August on this topic in Monterey, and it's being released tomorrow in time for Valentine's Day. So,
Exciting.
yeah, I am excited. Yeah, it's fun. But I really emphasize the power of psychological arousal, the power of engaging erotic themes, getting into a language of sexiness. You know, so many couples also will tell me, like, because we're not having so much sex, or there's a desire issue or a function issue, we kind of avoid all sexual contact all the time. Like even holding hands could be a little bit of a threat, or a kiss. And so eroticism has become completely like dehydrated from the overall relationship and the environment. So I do work a lot with couples, not on the sex part, just on the kind of allowing eroticism back into the space, you know, being able to be in a relationship where we can talk about kids and shopping lists and work and parents, but also flip and allow our sexual selves into the space for a little while. So I think that that erotic thread between sexual events is really important.
Naomi has a question that I'm going to paraphrase. Um, we've acknowledged the pandemic, and you said that you thought that people would be having more sex because of COVID, and really there's been a little bit less. I'll tell you that within my local sort of group of colleagues and community, we were saying that by the end of COVID, there would be two booms, a baby boom and a divorce boom, just from people being together 24/7. I'm curious, with that sort of erotic dehydration, with the ongoing stress and everything of life, how has our current situation in the country with COVID affected people's ability to be aroused, to experience desire, not just emotionally, but maybe even physiologically?
Well, I'd love to hear your opinions on this. To me, COVID was just like a magnifying glass of all the kinds of factors that can affect our sex lives. Again, biological factors like what we're taking into our systems, drinking, eating, medications. A lot of people went on anxiety medications. Those have big side effects. They reduce sexual function. Um, I think psychologically, a lot of us just weren't feeling our sexiest selves for one reason or another, and so we just didn't feel sexy sometimes in our own bodies. And I think self-esteem has so much to do with sex. I think relationally, again, like, we were pretty on top of each other. We're pretty enmeshed. I mean, that's something I'm really dealing with a lot. Like couples who used to go to work every day to separate offices, and they'd come home and reconnect, and there'd be something to talk about and some energy, who are now just, there's just too much closeness. And Esther Perel obviously talks a lot about, how relationships need dependability and reliability and transparency, but sex kind of thrives on some spontaneity and some unpredictability. So I think COVID kind of made it hard to be really unpredictable or spontaneous. And then I think that there's such a relationship between what's happening in our lives outside of the bedroom, how we're actualizing as individuals and couples, that kind of got stunted by just not having these sorts of external outputs. So I think all of that can happen at any time, but it was kind of like the perfect storm during COVID. That's my take. What do you think?
Well, my background's in cognitive behavioral therapy, so the brain-body connection is always a huge part of how I approach things. And I think that to your point and Esther's point about that need for mystery, that need for space, the closeness, the 24/7 quarantining has really taken away, from my opinion, or in my perspective, some people's ability to maintain the thought processes necessary to really be turned on and sexy and desirous of their partner. Like the fifth time we've heard them flush the toilet while we're on a webinar, it's going to wear you down. It's going to stop being sexy after a certain point. And the problem with our brain is it is wonderfully complex, magnificently smart, and woefully stupid, because it does believe what we tell it. So if our thought processes become, I'm not interested, this is so off-putting, I no longer find them sexy, I look at me, when our thought cycles become negative, that absolutely can impact the way our bodies and our brains respond to that. And we're going to experience not just the emotional challenges that you've been describing so well, but also potentially some physiological reactions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. Hopefully we can all just develop new rituals. I mean, constraints and challenges can sometimes yield innovation and originality. I think of myself, for example, really discovering Intercourse and really building sex scripts that were based on different kinds of behaviors. I think of the writer Milan Kundera, the novelist who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being, he describes how when Prague was being occupied by the Soviets, they were monitored at all times. All individual liberties were stripped away, and the only way that you could be an individual is through sex. And so there was a rise in sort of infidelity and liaisons and that sort of thing, because it was an expression of human existential individuality. Not suggesting that we have affairs or have infidelity, but COVID is a big constraint. And so the extent to which we could find originality in those constraints is also an opportunity.
I love that framing. I love the idea of creativity arising out of creative constraints and of limited resources. A lot of my clients in my practice would consider themselves more sexually creative, more sexually adventurous. I work with a lot of kink identified people, a lot of ethically non-monogamous people, which is not the infidelity of Milan Kundera. And I'm curious, how do you guide a couple where perhaps one person's desire framework is significantly more adventurous than the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, we all have different personalities. Some of us like to go to museums for vacations, and some of us like to ski down giant slopes and have adventure, right? Like, we have different personalities that get expressed in every aspect of life. So it makes sense that they would, get expressed during sex. I am a huge fan of play. And, the essence of kink is play, creating a scene, playing make-believe as adults, playing with power. I think it's a journey for a couple to get to that kind of face-to-face comfort. So I really begin with couples in a very side-by-side way. I always encourage couples to read erotic literature aloud together, or we're going through a boom in erotic podcasts. Frankly, we're going through a boom in what we would call ethical erotic video or ethical porn, where it's being made by performers who want to be there and are being treated well. And there's a lot of creativity happening. So sometimes just starting to take in like sexual material in a side-by-side way can be a really important step. And I guess I really emphasize, more than the behavior itself, the willingness to share your interest and your fantasy in the behavior. Sometimes actually acting out a fantasy is the worst thing that could ever happen. So I think I'm just a big fan of getting our erotic selves comfortable with exploring themes that turn us on, because a lot of us couldn't necessarily identify the things that the fantasies that we have or the turn-ons that we have. So getting comfortable with that identification and then being able to share it. I think that there's just so much sexiness in conversation or a little bit of play together. And so I find that there's a lot of overlap that couples can achieve. Where it can be difficult is if, one partner is really, on the thrill-seeking end of the spectrum and really wants to enjoy like consensual non-monogamy or things that are more than just the two of them or really outside the bedroom, and another partner does not, is not turned on by that. Then I think that there can be discrepancies that are harder to reconcile.
But that initial mindset of, your desire framework's not my desire framework, but your desire framework's okay.
Yes.
Getting to the point where they can share and talk and hear one another, I think is crucial. Let's go to the other extreme. How do you, what if somebody just isn't interested in sex at all? How do you approach the absence of a desire framework?
So I'm going to assume that we're talking a little bit about a couple, maybe, in which one partner is interested in sex and the other partner is not. I mean, of course,
number of couples that I've worked with where one of them will say, I could go the rest of my life without having sex, and that would be fine with me. I'm perfectly content without it.
Hmm. So I really emphasize to couples that desire is not the operative term. Willingness is. Forget desire with a capital D. Show up with willingness. If it's important to your partner, it's important to the relationship, and maybe it can be important or relevant to you in some way. I give assignments very often that I call willingness windows, where couples are allocating a window of time to engage in something sexy together. And I know that they're not going to show up with desire or mutual desire at the same time, but I do expect that they can show up with mutual willingness because it's important and because they've decided it's important. What can be very hard is when one partner is just going through the motions and really has no willingness. If there's even an iota of willingness, I can work with that. But if there's no willingness on the part of a partner, I don't know what to say. Do you? I mean, we're not magicians.
Usually, one of my sort of clinical touchstones is this idea that you decide what you're willing to tolerate, right?
Mhm.
You can ask for anything. You can ask for the moon, but people always have the right to say no.
Yeah.
And if we're in a situation where that willingness is absolutely absent, we can't change or influence that choice. We can only make decisions for ourselves about what we're willing to tolerate in our relationships.
100%. And I also want to say desire doesn't just operate in a relational framework. It's how we experience desire within our own personhood. And so some people can have a lot of desire, and some people can be really not experience desire. And I think that there's a real spectrum, including asexuality. And I think we have to respect all kinds of orientations, whether it's who we're attracted to or even what we want to do or how much we want to do something. So I've also found that sometimes somebody can be disconnected or dissociated from desire. Maybe it's due to trauma. I've worked with a lot of trans patients in the process of transitioning where they've really gone from one identity to a more authentic identity. And in the sort of false identity, there wasn't any desire. But once that they've become sort of embodied in the identity that they experience, desire sometimes turns on quite intensely. So desire is a funny thing. It's kind of like I have a leak in my building, and they were just saying water just goes wherever there's a little leak. I kind of feel like desire travels in mysterious, interesting ways as well.
The joy that we get to see in our trans clients when they're able to step into their authentic selves and when they are able to experience desire in a way that they might have never thought was possible before transitioning is one of the genuine highlights of our work for me.
Yeah, me too. I did a lot of my post-grad training at an LGBTQ center where I got to work with a lot of um, trans patients. I would say today I'm mainly working more with sort of gender fluid and sort of gender queer patients but it is fascinating work. And what I love to do with really any patient, but you brought up trans patients, as someone is sort of on that journey, I love to stay in touch with the exciters and the inhibitors, the turn-ons and the turn-offs, because they change incredibly as you're going through that process.
You mentioned trauma briefly, and I want to be really careful to separate that out from transitioning because trans people may experience a lot of traumas, but the transition itself is not. So I wanted to kind of parse that out very separately in asking, how does trauma influence somebody's sex script or somebody's desire framework?
Well, people experience sexual trauma that could create specific feelings, beliefs, ideas around sex and touch. So certainly people can experience sexual trauma that lives in the body. They can experience other kinds of trauma that live in the body. People can be terribly neglected, um, or terribly codependent, or over enmeshed. I mean, trauma comes in different forms, and it can affect sexuality in different ways. I have noticed with a lot of my patients that the anxiety around sex becomes its own trauma. Like, let's just say there's a guy, and when he was, I don't know, one day he had a sexual experience and things weren't functioning the way he wanted them to. And that was 20 years ago, but it led to a negative feedback loop of always worrying. And now that actually, that experience and that feedback loop has become a trauma itself that lives in the body.
Yeah. We have about 5 minutes left. One of the themes that I've heard throughout our conversation is the importance of communication, the importance of being able to share with our partners what turns us on and what doesn't, what we want and what we don't, to listen to them and to share ourselves. One area that is often difficult, I have found, is in giving feedback to our partners about what's working for us and what's not. It's one thing to talk about fantasy and sort of a hypothetical. It's another to say what you did last night didn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
How do you help your clients to give and receive sexual feedback?
Well, I think the reason sexual feedback is so hard is because we don't do it enough, and there's shame around it, because we have no problem giving our partners feedback in every other dimension of life, right? We have no problem complaining or criticizing or making ourselves heard. So in a certain sense, it's just about good communication and doing it, right? Like, there's just overall good communication in terms of being empathetic and being vulnerable and being motivated to have a constructive conversation. So I think just jumping in and having good, healthy communication is important. But I sometimes have noticed that patients will come in and they have a complaint. They know the problem that they're experiencing, right? They're very tuned into the problem. So then I'll ask them, well, what's the solution? Like, what do you actually want that's different? And then they might explain the connection they want, the romance, the kissing, a specific kind of stimulation, a specific position, a specific fantasy, right? I'm asking them, go beyond the problem and think about the solution. And then I'll say, oh, well, that's sexy, right? And you start to sex up that solution a little bit, because sexual language can be arousing and is sexy. And then you've really gone from just being having a complaint to really being a problem solver and actually being a fantasizer, and maybe being able to share elements of that solution and fantasy with a partner. So being able to express what you experienced that wasn't working, but also what would, in the form of a real nice desire.
I love that. Instead of perhaps focusing on what went wrong, ask for what you would enjoy next time.
Right.
You know what I've been thinking about? I keep imagining you fill in the blank. All of a sudden, feedback becomes much more erotic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just a few minutes left, but we also have one last question. Speaking of romance, somebody asks, with respect to Valentine's Day coming up, what advice do you have for couples or even single people to combat all of the expectations and stress related to this Hallmark holiday?
Well, you can just ignore it and not deal with it. I think to me, Valentine's Day is just it's an opportunity to maybe prioritize romance or sensuality or sexuality. I mean, look, throughout COVID, we had to develop new rituals around how we celebrate a birthday party, how we go to a funeral, how we dance with our partner, whatever it is. We developed so many new rituals. Some cases we're continuing. Sometimes we've gone back to older rituals. Valentine's Day is just a nice day to maybe be sexy and maybe be sexual and maybe start a new ritual around sex.
I love that. every holiday, every day is an opportunity to create something new with our partners.
Yeah, and to start to ritualize it. I think it's important to really bring sex into your life in a very integrated way and to recognize it as important, essential, and healthy in large part. You know, obviously, um, there are exceptions, but so any opportunity to celebrate the centrality of sexuality and the power of eros.
And on that note, I think that is a wonderful point to leave us on: the power of Eros, the importance of communication, the significance of relationships with our partners, with ourselves. Thank you so much, Ian, for having this conversation with me. I truly hope at some point in the future we get to do it in the same room, but I always enjoy chatting with you, and I'm so excited to be able to share Detroit with you through the power of the World Wide Web.
Thank you. Maybe one day next time I'll be talking to you about your book.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yep. Okay. Take care, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Ian and Stephanie, for being with us and for such an enlightening discussion. And thanks to all of you at home for joining us. Remember, you can buy Ian's book by visiting culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. Our next event is with Michigan author Tracy Cohen, who wrote My Life on the Autism Spectrum: Misunderstandings, Insight, and Growth, on Sunday, February 27th at 1 p.m. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair, for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time.